Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast explores topics relevant to psychedelic culture, medicine, or research, and anything sort of, like explicitly psychedelic or not. And there are a lot of episodes that are not explicitly psychedelic, although relate to what I believe to be one of the core sort of questions around psychedelics in the modern world, which is like, what are they for? Why do we use them? And in that sense, it's a cultural question. And in this podcast, I hope to bring explorations around topics, like I said, related to, but also not always so explicitly related to psychedelics, so as to feed into those cultural questions in a way that creates a substrate for psychedelics to be integrated into the Western world without, to quote one of the previous guests, Geronimo MM, amputating other parts of their potentials in order to fit them inside of a box that already exists inside of our society, but doesn't necessarily fit psychedelics. So that's what this podcast is about. And some episodes are more explicitly psychedelic than others. And this is one of those episodes because it's explicitly about psychedelics as memory modulators. Maria Balaet is on the show to talk specifically about this. This is her area of research currently, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So, Maria Balaet is a computational neuroscientist at Imperial College London. Her main research aim is to develop computational tools with clinical application that can be used to investigate how cognition and brain activity change over time in healthy people and neurology patients. Previously, she was a student at the University of Birmingham. She developed an interest in pharmacological modulation of memory and how psychedelic drugs specifically could be used to treat mental health conditions related to maladaptive memories. Alongside, she runs her own virtual lab called Science Camp, which is PSYENCE, coming soon at science.camp, which aims to elucidate how psychedelics impact cognition in the general healthy population. In naturalistic settings, great reading there. When not pursuing science, she is a painter and a fiction writer. So again, we have Maria on the show to talk about psychedelics as memory modulators. And without too much more preamble before we get into the interview, huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially those whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode. Those people are giving at least $23 a month. If you are not yet a patron and you are not negatively impacted significantly by the economic consequences of the current global pandemic, then it would be awesome if you could throw a little bit of money towards the show. And you can do so by becoming my patron on Patreon. Anyone who donates $8 or more gets access to a special Dropbox folder with a bunch of exclusive content that otherwise is unavailable or you'd have to pay for each piece. So please head over to patreon.com/JamesWJesso to become a patron. Everything is something, and even as little as $4 or so a month really goes a long way. So please and thank you for doing that. If Patreon's not your thing, PayPal is an option as well if you'd like to do a one-time donation, or you can buy something off the shop like a t-shirt or a book. So, which is all at jameswjesso.com/support or listed in the links in the show notes to this episode or in the description, wherever you're checking it out. So that's it for the intro. Please enjoy my interview with Maria Balaet here on Adventures Through the Mind. Actually, one thing that I almost forgot to mention here. I just want to apologize in advance. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I jumbled up my gain on my mic and I didn't realize it, and the recording was weird. I won't explain it, but there's a few points where I just redline the hell out of the audio and it gets very distorted. It doesn't jump in volume, but the distortion is bad and it feels like a real, like a rookie mistake, but I did it and I apologize. So there's a couple moments where my audio is quite poor and I thank you for your forgiveness in advance. Okay, now this is my interview with Maria Balaet on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 123. Enjoy. And you're on the show to talk about basically psychedelics and how psychedelics modulate the memory and how it impacts the memory. So psychedelics as memory modulators. And so if we're going to go there, maybe we can start with what is it that we need to understand about memory and the brain in order to understand the proposals you're making around psychedelics as memory modulators?
Right. So this is actually quite a complex question to begin with, because memory in itself is quite a complex process, and the only way to actually understand what memory is all about is by actually putting some things into perspective, such as what is memory used for, where is this process happening, and what is needed for memory to occur. And one way in which I like to start talking about memory is actually forgetting it for, no pun intended, for a split second, and just talking about the brain in general and about consciousness and what this is. So I'm going to begin by saying that the object of interest for this talk is actually the human brain and how the human brain operates with memory, which is why I think this process is super interesting here. And in order to do so, we need to talk a bit about why memory arises in the human brain and why consciousness arises in the human brain to begin with. So the brain is a biological organ. We all know about it. We've pretty much had it since we were born, the majority of us. And even so, it's still very, very little understood. But the brain has not been in its current shape into the reality that we're walking in since forever. It's actually a product of evolution. And we can see that there are a lot of other species on Earth that do have a brain as well, however, not able to perform as complex functions as the human brain. So what I'm trying to say here is that the human brain is a process of evolution. It has gotten to be where it is today through a very complex process of updating itself for many, many thousands of years. And it is the reason why we are conscious beings and walking on Earth. And the reason why I want to start by saying this is because I want to make the point that consciousness is embodied to begin with. And by embodied consciousness, I mean that the biological processes that are happening inside of our heads are what actually leads to the conscious experience and everything that we are experiencing on a daily basis, which is something that I have previously been challenged on, for example, because I know there are many, many theories out there about what is consciousness, what gives rise to it. But for the purpose of this discussion and the type of research that I am doing, we start from the assumption that the brain is the sole generator of consciousness, and this consciousness is embodied. And not only that it is embodied, but it has other properties, such as the fact that it is personal. So two human beings do not share the same consciousness. The conscious experience is very, very subjective to an individual, which is actually one of the main reasons why it is very, very difficult to study it and to make sense of what is it that we all share rather than how we are all different. Consciousness is also continuous, and what this means is that we are having some sort of a stable conscious state throughout the day, for example, or throughout living. People don't generally walk around changing from one conscious state to the other. And by conscious state, I don't mean feelings about a particular things necessarily. I mean, you don't walk on the street and suddenly the next second you are drunk walking on the street, and then back, and then you're in a psychedelic state and all of these things. Because if that would be the case, then that's a more complex psychiatric and neurological problem that needs to be addressed. But in health, consciousness is continuous. And another property of it, which is quite important, is the fact that it is dependent on attention. So this means that the focus that we have is going to dictate most of the times what our conscious experience is. And this focus can be either explicit, we know exactly I'm looking at this thing and I'm interested in it, therefore this dictates how my conscious experience is going to unfold, or implicit, you just have this background thoughts about what's going on that are actually going to dictate how you react and how you behave. Now that I've laid this down with the properties of consciousness, I want to bring to the table how memory comes into the process and how we end up from this thing to talking about memory. So there's this researcher who actually won a Nobel Prize, not for his work on memory, but for his work in immunology. His name is Gerald Edelman. And he did come up with a theory of consciousness that did have memory at the core. So his theory of consciousness actually coined neural Darwinism. And it operates on 3 principles. And the first principle would be that it relates entirely to the structure of the brain, I would say. So the first principle that he's talking about is the neuronal differentiation, the fact that the brain is a structure made out of different neurons with different functions. There's many different types of neurons that are in the brain, and not all of them are fulfilling the same scope while they're being there. And this would be the first principle. And then the second principle is that these different neurons, different types of neurons, so this structural differentiation is also connected via synapses, therefore leading to a functional interplay. So because there are different neurons with different functions that are now communicating together, then the brain as a whole can emerge having different functions. And at the same time, the third principle, which is actually the most relevant for what we're going to be talking about, is the principle of re-entry. And Gerald Edelman argues that this is what makes humans particularly special and distinct to machines or robots, for the matter, because what this means is that we can change our experience of reality in every single given moment based on the information that is being presented to us, and do that quite fundamentally. Well, of course, arguably nowadays we are reaching technologies that are able to inflict this type of perspectives on AI systems as well. But back in the days 100 years ago of Gerald Edelman, that was not necessarily the case, and I'm not sure whether he was thinking about the current state of AI when, even in perspective, when he was mentioning this. So based on all of these things that I've just said, he came to the conclusion that consciousness must therefore be the remembered present, which is something that I did find out a couple of years ago, and I thought that it's very similar to what, in my perception, could be declared as consciousness, actually, and this being memory in action. The fact that on every single given moment, your current experience is a function of all of the previous experiences that you've had, basically. And yeah, and I think that I've introduced where the starting point by all of this.
Great. Yeah, okay, so that's interesting. Now, I kind of want you to tap a little bit more deeply into this idea of that consciousness is embodied before we get in a little bit, because you're talking about how memory will change direct experience. It reminds me of this phrase I had heard a long time ago that I really liked, which is the ever-present origins. That we're moving through the world carrying our ever-present origins. So everything that has happened to us throughout the course of our lives, which, I mean, I know that you expressed that we're focusing on personal consciousness here, but even that is an extension of like the larger patterns of history that gave rise to the context in which you were born, and the sort of like psychological, physical, emotional, social context of the nest in which you were raised, which exists beyond the person and beyond even the family unit and the family line. But we're carrying around these ever-present origins, and they're informing how we show up in the world, and that it's embodied. So if I'm understanding you correctly, which is that this is of course a psychological experience, but it's indistinguishable from, or it's inseparable, from the physiological experience you're having at any given moment. Although it feels like it's this ethereal thing that's up in your head, whatever consciousness with a big C might be, consciousness as we're talking about it here is something that is entirely dependent on the unique functioning of your specific brain, which is wired into your entire nervous system, which is, not just a brain function situation, because it's also dependent on how all your organs are operating and how much maybe about muscular tension you're having, which could be an extension of a psychological process, but could be, an extension of whatever other thing. So which then leads into pharmacological intervention of memory operation. So did I get a good sense of what you mean when you say embodied
Yeah,
consciousness?
yeah. So precisely. I think, in a nutshell, the way to express what I mean by embodied consciousness is strictly, you cannot have a free consciousness walking around without a body.
Sure. I mean, like
Or at least
some
no one has actually physically said this in the medical literature so far that has been peer reviewed and published, although there are many theories around about various forms of consciousness that exist without a body. However, that is outside my field, to say
right.
so.
Yeah. Fair enough. I was gonna say, like, I could think of probably quite a number of people who are listening who have
Absolutely.
can claim direct experience. Um,
Absolutely. It's very fun to entertain a range of ideas. However, it is outside my particular field, and I cannot by any means call myself an expert in disembodied consciousness.
Great. So
Yeah.
let me get a better sense of memory as like an operation of the brain. Because if we're going to talk about how psychedelics impact memory, maybe we can get a sense of memory and the operation of the brain. So in that, I mean, how do we remember things? What is the process biologically, but also like psychologically? Like, how would we describe how a person remembers things?
Right. So memory is not only about remembering, really. I think memory is more of an umbrella term that can actually be used for describing a range of processes. So let me just begin by stating generally what memory is. So memory could be regarded in the simplest form as the operation by which the brain processes sensory information from the environment, runs it through its filters, and then it stores it inside for the purpose of retrieving it in the future and using that information in a particular context where it might be useful. And this has a couple of sub processes that lead to memory happening. So the first one is encoding. And by encoding, I mean just laying down the memory initially. When you're first presented to a stimuli, and your brain registers it and wants to lay down, that is the process of encoding. And then we have the process of consolidation, which happens straight after the process of encoding, meaning that once the situation has passed, the brain undergoes a couple of physiological processes, which leads to the storage of this memory, which is the next part. And then the memories are stored. There have been a couple of theories around how this is actually happening. And then is the process of retrieval, where you're essentially fishing out pieces of information from your brain and reusing them in your particular context, depending on what it is that you want to do. So I think that this would be the general framework of things and how I approach memory, by discussing each of its components individual and then putting them as a whole to generate what we know that memory is.
Right. So when I say remembering, I'm kind of pointing specifically to the retrieval more so,
Exactly,
where
exactly.
memory
Yeah.
itself might be like the whole process, and then also everything that is stored within everything that we have encoded.
Exactly, exactly. That's precisely it. And the retrieval in itself, I think this is the primary focus on people generally. However, since memory actually relates to a number of other processes as well, all of them being interdependent, retrieval is, of course, dependent on everything that happens prior and ultimately to the first time that you've been presented to that stimuli.
So this brings in another question for me, and this is something I've wondered about for quite a while. And I mean, I don't have the same level of academic immersion, so correct my language if I'm getting it off here. Which is this wondering around explicit and implicit memories. And when I think about memory generally, I'm usually thinking about memory in the sense of like basically being able to recollect things, or things coming to mind from excuse me. Hopefully that's not the COVID.
Let's hope.
Oh my God. So yeah, things coming to mind, sort of arising out of the background of my experience, and all of a sudden I'm re-encountering events from my past or something, or feeling as though in our conversation, feeling as though there is something being remembered but being incapable of recollecting the context in which the memory is arising from. Like the fact that I recognized you but couldn't figure out why till sometime later, where I was like, oh, we met like 3 years ago and hung out for a whole afternoon, and I totally forgot about that. Or 4 years ago at this point.
For
Yeah. So this whole memory process, so implicit and explicit memory is what I'm thinking about now. So we have this explicit, I'm remembering a thing, but then what about memories that are not about remembering a thing? In fact, there's no conscious awareness that anything is
Mhm.
being remembered. There's only the perception of things arising as presently real and in the body, for example. So if I think about, if I hear glass breaking, for example, my whole body might respond as though I'm about to be cut, or I might, something along those
Yeah,
lines, you know? Yeah.
no, so I get what you're saying. Yes. So now with the process of retrieval, there's been two theories. One of them, which is actually majorly discarded nowadays, but there's been two theories around how this is actually happening, and one of them is very much related to what you've been saying, and I'm going to get into that once I name the one that's been discarded.
Hmm.
So one of the earliest theories about how memory retrieval is happening is actually relating to let's just say we take an object, and for the purpose here, I'm just going to take this nail polish here. You want to fish this out of your brain and to think about nail polish. Well, one of the earliest theories was saying that when you want to fish something out of your brain, you're going to be thinking about the concept that you want to take out, and then you're going to compare that with all of the other available similar contents that you have in the brain up until you are sure of which one it is the correct one, and then that's going to come to be retrieved. This has been proved to be not very easy to demonstrate in scientific practice,
Hmm.
but so then people have been focused on another way that retrieval is happening, and that is cue-based retrieval. So this would mean that you're looking at something into your environment, or you are processing a sound, as you've mentioned earlier, and that triggers the unfolding of the memory. Once again, that triggers the process of retrieval, and this can happen willingly. So a way that this could happen willingly is, for example, with those people who are studying for exams and they're thinking of chewing gum. In the scope of when they're chewing gum in the exam itself, the memories of what they've been studying is going to come back to them. Or it can happen without actually willing to, and is, as you've mentioned earlier, with the glass breaking, for example, and that's triggering a memory of pieces of glass shattering or anything related to that, or even worse, in certain cases, addictive memory or post-traumatic memories, for example. Yeah.
So it's interesting because one of the things that I've and this is like this maybe foregoes the personal consciousness. One of the things that I've wondered about, because part of what the life I've lived over the years is that I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different places, but often things that at a core level are very similar. So I've been to many, many conferences and many, many festivals, and I've met a lot of people in those contexts. Sometimes I've met the same people in different places. And so I have all these things in my mind that I've experienced and been in different cities. And so I get kind of confused about what I'm remembering from where at some point. It's
Mm-hmm.
terrible for remembering people a lot of the times. And something that I realized when I was away, living away from where I live now for quite some time, and when I go back to a place, is that it seems as though my memories, like of the things that have happened in my life, and even the way I was thinking about stuff, this is very much like maybe this remembered present, seems to be in some sense, obviously internally, but encoded in my environment. Like when I moved back to
Mm-hmm.
my hometown, I started having memories of things that had happened throughout the course of my childhood and my adolescence that were completely gone from my frame of mind while I
Mm-hmm.
while I was off doing things. It would be because I walked past a certain area, and I saw a thing that would brought this up. So it's interesting to think about that for myself, and maybe you could share your thoughts on this, where, the ability to recollect, and even, I don't think you talked about this, but to get a memory into long-term potentiation or whatever, to get it stored in long-term memory, is very much dependent on continuously re-immersing yourself into the environment in which that memory occurred, the context in which the event that is being remembered occurred.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So long-term potentiation is something that happens. It's a byproduct of memory consolidation, basically, which I haven't gone into much detail so far. But shall I perhaps just like delve into explaining just briefly the pharmacological mechanism, for example, with memory consolidation, and what is actually happening in the brain when this emerges, right? So when you are presented with a new situation or with a new scenario, anything similar, and you are going to encode that memory, your brain is lighting up, it's firing during the process of trying to understand what's going on around you. And as this is happening, the neurons, each individual neurons, get stimulated with electrical activity. And this stimulation of electrical activity inside the neurons is triggering the tiny vesicles in the brain that are filled with glutamate, which is an essential neurotransmitter. We're going to see how it's involved very, very soon. It makes these vesicles of glutamate to migrate towards the synapse, to the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft is the point where two neurons meet. There's actually a gap in between them. They're not tied together. And the vesicles come from one side. I'm not sure whether me using my hands is very helpful in explaining this, but I'm going to go ahead anyways. Yeah. And then as they do so, they travel out of the neurons. The vesicles merge with the membrane, and they release their contents in between the two neurons, and they travel to the other neuron. Well, now onto the other neuron, there are something called NMDA receptors. NMDA receptors are absolutely crucial for what we're talking about here, because they're actually the main reason why memories do get encoding consolidated. And the reason for that is that the glutamate coming from the other neuron is displacing magnesium ions, which are blocking these NMDA receptors. So in the normal homeostatic state, these NMDA receptors have a tiny blob of magnesium, let's just represent it like this, on the top of them. And then glutamate comes, displaces that, and binds to the NMDA receptors. This then triggers an entire calcium cascade in the next neuron happening, and leads to even more firing. Now, this process, as I've explained it now, happening in multiple neurons at the same time, leads to all of these neurons firing together. And you've probably heard of the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. Mm-hmm. And this is currently believed to be the best understanding that we have so far of how memories are being laid down. And what is interesting about this is that the more neurons fire together, the more you get this process of long-term potentiation. And long-term potentiation, as the name suggests, is something that relates to the memory being able to persist much more in your brain. The saying goes that if you do not then go further to activate this memory and reinforce this, you get something called long-term depression. So what you get is downside of this is basically the antagonizing process of this long-term potentiation called long-term depression, where the memories actually become destabilized. And now, how is this long-term potentiation being facilitated over and over again to strengthen the memories that you have? This is where something that I have studied quite a lot in my undergraduate degree called reconsolidation of memory comes in. So every single time that you're presented with the new information, your memory becomes it's once again encoded and once again consolidated. The process is called reconsolidation. It becomes liable to disruption. If you don't do this, if you don't just like take the memory out, then it's just going to not become salient because you're not reinforcing that same thing. So perhaps when you are going back to your hometown, for example, after, let's just say, hypothetically, you haven't been there for 20 years, then that's not going to be a very salient memory to you. And you're not able to remember it on a daily basis because you're not being presented with it as you go along. And when you go there, what you might actually notice is that, yes, it comes back to you, but it's very, very liable to disruption. So if someone that you meet there tells you, oh, when you were 5, you used to be here and do this, even though you don't personally remember that, if you remember anything remotely similar, that entire memory might be reshifted into something else. So I would say that what we need to keep an eye on in this context of talking about memories is also that they're very, very malleable here. So yeah, well, if you have something that you're doing on a daily basis, then and you continuously enforce that, then that's going to stay with you and it's going to be much easier to recollect. And to address another point that you've made earlier with meeting a lot of people, well, I think that you give the answer in it yourself because you're meeting a lot of different faces, different people all the time, and you probably don't spend enough time together with each of them for them to lead to this long-term potentiation process because their figure is maybe not the most salient or something. And then when you see them again after a long, long time, that information hasn't sedimented properly and it's even more liable to disruption. Reason why, if you meet someone that looks remotely familiar and then they tell you their version of how you've met, you might update your own version of how you've actually met based on that. Or, yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that memories are very complex, dynamic, and it's very difficult to actually pinpoint them to this is the memory, this is its content, because it's such a malleable content. It's like it's like instead of being in a bottle, it's in one of those bags that has holes in it, and it's like a porous membrane. It can also go out of what inside the bottle, and well, I'm not sure whether this metaphor makes sense. I'm really trying to like.
Well, it's interesting because like an example that comes to mind is that I have memories from my childhood that I remember not because I remember the event happening, but I remember the event happening in the form of how it was described to me by adults later in life. And then, yeah, so that's what came up for me as you were talking. And it's also interesting too, because this process where memories that have been consolidated, the content of the memory can arise, and depending on the situation in which it arises, it can be updated. And in that update, there could be like repetition errors where it gets updated maybe incorrectly, it evolves over time, or it could be upgraded not so much incorrectly, but evolving, changing over time. And that in the content of this memory, it's not just faces or names or physical sensations, but there's also an aspect of what that memory means. Like meaningness is also content for memory. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So there's a couple of. I guess what I've explained so far is more of the very molecular and cellular level, exactly what's happening inside the neurons. But the brain is not independent neurons working together necessarily. It's systems. It's organized itself in systems. And there's a couple of brain regions which are particularly important in laying down memories. One of them, which is the hippocampus, which is probably the most famous region that's involved in memories. And while we've known that the hippocampus is very, very important for this from previous studies, historically it has been demonstrated that if you remove the hippocampus from someone's brain, that person is not going to be able to form new memories. But more recently, I think just like 2 years ago, if I am correct, there's this team at Cambridge University that has done a very interesting experiment looking at the hippocampus. So they put people into the scanner, and then they were showing them images from a film called Forrest Gump. You've probably heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
And then they were trying to look at the activity of the hippocampus in real time as the people were being asked to memorize the scenes in the film that they were watching. So what they were seeing is that when people were actively trying to memorize, then the activity in the hippocampus was going up. And when they would stop memorizing, so at the end of the film scene that was being presented to them, the activity in the hippocampus would go back down again to the baseline level. So the hippocampus is one of the brain regions that's super, super important here. But there are a couple of others which I would like to mention as well. So one of them is the prefrontal cortex, which is majorly responsible for us being able to choose what we are trying to memorize or not. So if we're interested in memorizing something in particular, then we're going to make much more of an effort. And this is how this brain region is going to be involved in the process by facilitating this more higher order process like decision making about something. And another region which is super important is amygdala. And here is actually where I'm finally getting to answer the question that you're asking about the emotional salience of memories. Because the amygdala is a region in the brain that is particularly important for anything that's emotional content. And the general association of the amygdala is to do with fear, for example, with fear memories. So let's just say in the context of diseases such as post-traumatic disorder, by having a very, very emotionally challenging experience or something that induces a great degree of fear, that's going to lead to the memory being encoded into the hippocampus much strongly. And it's actually really fascinating because the amygdala and the hippocampus are actually so close together, biologically speaking, that it just poses the question at the end of the day of how important memory is for us as a species in terms of this ability to learn about fearful stimuli in the environment in order to avoid them later on. So this is in great lines how it's happening. However, not to say here, because I understand that what I'm saying might also lead to the conclusion that there is just these three distinct brain regions that are involved in encoding memories and in stabilizing them and so on. But that's not actually the case. It's not like it's these particular regions and only them. The brain is a dynamic system. It's a particularly dynamic system where there's a lot of information flowing inside of it. And of course, more other regions are involved, such as the thalamus for sensory encoding and the cerebellum for procedural memories that involve moving your body, for example. And there's electrical signals do travel around the brain in many other regions, not only the ones that I mentioned, but this would be of particular notice. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So getting into the brain chat about different parts of the brains that are associated with memory leads into some of the questions I have about how psychedelics impact the memory. But before I get into those specific questions, maybe you can give us a rundown of what you've observed in your research, what you're proposing, insofar as how do psychedelics impact the memory?
Right. So I've been looking at this question in a number of different ways in the past couple of years. The first time that I come in contact with this idea, I was doing in vivo research with ketamine derivates on trying to, in vivo research meaning using rodent models, and the models were for addiction and post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we were attempting to do with this derivative of ketamine called MK801 was to completely abolish the fearful memories or the addictive memories, for the matter. And the way that we would do this would be by trying to disrupt the reconsolidation of these memories. So what this means is that the animals, the subjects, would learn certain fearful stimuli, and then when they would be presented with it again, after we made sure that they learned it, then straight after, they would be administered the substance, MK801. And then what we would notice afterwards is that that the same fearful stimuli would no longer elicit a response in them. So I thought, oh, wow, this is so cool. Therefore, it must mean that we must be able to take this into humans and see what happens. Well, the story goes that MK101 is a drug that's highly toxic to humans. No one should ever use this. Right. And anecdotally speaking, I do actually know a person who, out of curiosity, tried this drug. It wasn't a pleasant experience, and yeah, I would not recommend that to absolutely anyone. So do not go try this at home, to the listeners. Absolutely not. But then the idea emerged, well, there are psychedelics. Psychedelics seem to be the substances that are particularly safe for the human brain. They're non-toxic, they're non-addictive. And when these ideas were emerging into my brain was in 2014, which also coincides with the year when I think, looking back, that is when interest in psychedelics started increasing exponentially into the world. Because back in those days, I do remember in 2014, I was in the medical school library, and I just had this drive to find all of the articles to date that were published on psychedelics, and I managed to download them all to that point and read them in the subsequent months. This is no longer possible nowadays. Nowadays, the rate at which research on psychedelics is coming out has increased exponentially. But right, let's go back to the memory modulation. What has my research shown to date? So then I started looking into it more from a theoretical perspective, because before you try to do anything in humans with psychedelics, you need to lay down the theories. And this is what made the body of work that I've been presenting around at conferences, and also how you found about my work by my Breaking Convention presentation. And what I'm talking about, how psychedelics influence each component of memory in turn. And then this has emerged into developing this theoretical framework of how we can look at psychedelics perhaps as agents that can be used for memory modulation into the process of reconsolidation. However, while this is a theory that I do personally believe is quite substantiated, it is suggested by the other research in the field that this might be the case and it might work. And I'm actually going to comment on one study perhaps more later, but there has only been one study in humans of this kind using psychoactive compounds, and that was with ketamine. It was published in Nature Communications last year, and they did have very good results, meaning that they managed to disrupt the reconsolidation of alcoholism cues, so this type of disruptive memories. But one of the things that we do not actually understand about memory to date is specifically how is it affected in the human brain while you are on psychedelics in health. So forgetting for a second about the therapeutic context and how we can use them as actually memory modulators, first, the questions that arise are, how does the brain react? How does the memory function change once the person is under the influence of psychedelics? And to answer this question, there are a number of studies out there that are addressing this. There are a number of studies that are addressing generally cognition under psychedelics. But one important mention that I need to make here is that the largest study that I came across that measures cognition under the influence of psychedelics, like acute cognition, so exactly when you're in the state, had 25 participants, which is very little. Mm-hmm. So last year, I actually launched my first study on psychedelics on humans, and it was a field study because I was particularly interested in looking at cognition in naturalistic settings. So meaning not in a basement in the lab, as this is the controlled setting where studies usually take place. And I did gather data on approximately 50 participants. And what we do is the way that I've tested their memory was on two different tasks. So one of the tasks was trying to memorize while they are sober a list of words. They were non-emotionally salient words whatsoever. They weren't connected to each other. And then do a recall test, of course, and then try to see whether when they're on psychedelics, what happens to their memory. It's safe to say that people's memories of this words was very, very disrupted once they came back on psychedelics. However, one thing that I need to mention here as a limitation is that there were different times in between when the person memorized the words and when the person was recalling the words for the test. And the reason for that being that this was a field study, it was happening at a festival, and people were taking part on the basis of they were given informed sober consent, and then they would memorize the words afterwards, and then they would have the choice of coming back when they were on psychedelics. And that's when we would test the psychedelic state, which was completely at their choice, because we weren't wishing to interfere with that. And so the short-term memory, in terms of trying to remember just words, the long-term memory, was disrupted. And then the other experiment that they were doing was something similar, but this time they didn't have to memorize a list of words. They tried to memorize a story. And the story was made as such that it actually had the flow, it made sense, it had a number of details and so on. And something very, very interesting happened in the results of this particular study. We noticed that people they do have a better recall, I would say, than those who just try to memorize the words. So they did remember the gist of the story, but the details that they were providing were novel. And yeah, exactly. So it wasn't remember quite the same. The details were quite modified, and that was an interesting thing, which made me think that of course, you do also have other processes going on, like confabulation over the top of the psychedelics field. And it just highlighted once again how difficult, methodologically speaking, studying memory under the influence of psychedelics is, because it's very difficult to ascertain what goes on in the person's brain when they're trying to retrieve things, and how much of that is being generated in the moment as they speak, or how much of it is actually encoded. Yeah.
So your research has generally led to sort of the suggestion, according to your talks, that one of the things that we could use psychedelics for is inside of a therapeutic context to optimize the sort of like the brain's ability to change memories. And in doing so, we use psychedelics to very intentionally alter a memory of the past that is giving rise to psychiatric illness. So something along the lines of, so I have this experience as a child that leads me to feeling like the remembered present is always the ongoing origins of worthlessness, and that informs everything that I do in the world, to the point where I have a lifestyle and set of behaviors that has totally disrupted me, and I feel depressed. And that with psychedelics, there could be a possibility to go back in and change those early memories in a way where the downstream effects and how I show up in the world are no longer as detrimental to my health, and thus an inevitable, or not a likely outcome would be my lifestyle changes, my perception of the world changes, my perception of self changes, my behavior changes, my relationships change, my life context change. I'm not depressed. Can you talk a little bit about psychedelics in that role?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And precisely as you've illustrated here, these are some of the conclusions that I came to in perspective. So far, I must say this prior to what's going to follow. I have not run any study with psychedelics in humans so far to test the process of reconsolidation. This is entirely a theoretical framework as we are speaking, and the efforts so far to understand how memory gets influenced by psychedelics have been limited towards just understanding, is the memory altered? Are people still able to remember? In what way do they remember things? And it has been focused more around this very narrow concepts compared to the ones of using them therapeutically for actually changing the memories. But just as you've mentioned, and let's just go with the example that you've provided with the depression originating in childhood and so on. And let's just say that's being triggered on a daily basis in various contexts. So the way that this would work in theory with psychedelics would be by bringing the person that's been affected into a therapeutic setting with experienced therapists, and having, of course, developed guidelines by that stage of how to use these substances and to ensure all safety around, and then having a therapy session while the person is going to be remembering what initially caused that memory, or whether it is triggered by a particular event, for example, or whether it is just pure existential anguish that cannot be pinpointed to something. Just delve into that, or generally just focus on the particular point where that memory becomes disruptive, and what is the negative connotation of it that leads to the unfolding process of depression. And by discussing that, then with the help of the therapist, assigning new meanings to what the memory is. So what's going to happen in this moment is that the memory of that the depression is going to be reconsolidated, but instead, because the reconsolidation of this is going to be disrupted by the consolidation of new memories, by a completely new outlook on the matter. So in theory, what will happen afterwards is, once the person exits the therapy room, when they think about their memories of depression once again, or when they think about their depression, they no longer have the same feelings associated with it. They no longer have the same memory of what it feels and everything. They might remember how it used to feel in the past, but now the same thing doesn't elicit the same response anymore. And this is where I actually wanted to talk about this study with ketamine, which I haven't done it myself, but to the best of my knowledge, this is the only study in the world in humans that has been using a substance that's remotely psychedelic, because as we do know from other studies, ketamine does have psychedelic properties. Some people would report, especially at higher doses. And this is the only study so far that has done something like this. And what they've done is that they took alcoholics, people who were insanely triggered by alcohol cues. Like, you show someone a glass of wine, for example, and they want to drink as well. Something that similarly happens with smoking and a lot of other types of addiction, for example. And they took people with alcoholism, and then they took them to the lab. They injected them with ketamine. And after they injected them with ketamine, they presented these stimuli with them that were portraying alcohol as a hugely toxic compound. So they were inducing this maladaptive new cues to the person. And they ran this with just ketamine, with like some control. So this means just ketamine without showing them the alcohol cues that were meant to diminish their reaction to alcohol, and people that received a placebo. And what they noticed by comparing these three groups at the end is that the people who were told by these cues that alcohol is a toxic substance, while they were on ketamine, then they no longer wanted to engage with alcohol stimuli on day-to-day basis. They were doing a ranking of how much drinking they're doing in a simple week. So these were all alcoholics, essentially. They were drinking every single day. But the people who were presented with this information about how bad alcohol is during the ketamine trip, they no longer wanted to engage with it, because they actually what the researchers were saying is that they do think that this is a product of the reconsolidation of memories about how they view alcohol, because before they used to associate alcohol strongly with a reward, while now it's no longer a reward, it was a poison. And that might be the explanation why this has happened, because this is not an effect that has been observed in people who just took ketamine and let the substance do its thing without any therapeutic intervention, or the people who just took a placebo instead. So yeah.
So a couple things are coming up here. One of which is, I'm thinking of A Clockwork Orange, and he's got his eyes pinned open, forced to see all this violent imagery while he's going through profound sickness, as a way of ultimately it's brainwashing. In that context, and even in a therapeutic context, it's benevolent, but it sounds like brainwashing. So Can you comment a little bit about that? Because
Yeah,
I mean, there's
absolutely.
definitely a history of psychedelics being used for brainwashing in cult situations, but also, MK Ultra,
Yeah,
and possibly accidentally inside of, online echo chambers communities that sort of propagate delusional ideation, with psychedelic use
absolutely.
being at their core.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for asking this. Generally, thank you for asking this because this is one of the things that I think the first time I've addressed this was last year at my Breaking Convention presentation, because I've been talking about the potential of using psychedelics in this reconsolidation memory framework for, I would say, over 5 years to today. And not once have I been asked about the
Hmm.
dangers. um, but there are obviously dangers. No one should ever attempt at home to try to manipulate their memories using psychedelics. Like, this is by all means not something that people should do in unsupervised practices without proper guidelines that have been tested in laboratory settings and received approvals and so on. So this goes, I hope, without saying, but I'm just going to reiterate it anyways. Um, but I guess that your question is a bit more profound than that, because your question doesn't necessarily relate to the end user reading about these possibilities online, watching a YouTube talk or something like this, and then thinking, okay, so tomorrow I'm going to think about all my addictions and bad cues, and I'm going to think about each of them in turn while on under the influence of a high dose of psychedelics, and then I'm going to be refreshed and a new person the next day. This is not what this is suggesting whatsoever. And I think that there is generally a risk. There is generally a risk for using psychedelics for brainwashing, and we have seen it before. Historically speaking, psychedelics have been abused in many instances, which is actually uh, corroborated with everything else that has happened ages ago when I wasn't actually even born, but based on my reading and so on, did lead to the to making them illegal and to banning of these substances worldwide. I think there's definitely a risk, and while there is a risk, I do think that it's a risk that is manageable. And what I mean by there is a risk that is manageable is that I think it starts with education, education of the general public about what psychedelics are, how they are used, what their potential is, and especially how they can affect different people, different healthy people to begin with, in their effects on cognition, their effects on emotions, and so on. Um, and this is education that, if people do have from school level, for example, in in an ideal society where psychedelics are decriminalized, destigmatized, and so on, this would be the case. Then these people would be able to make their own informed choices about the context in which psychedelics are being taken. So then it's only malicious intentions that are left to deal with.
Hmm.
And with malicious intentions, now I think that this is an entirely different subject whatsoever, but they're tricky to deal with, right? Because this is a fundamental problem of society. And what's important here is that it's not psychedelics which are the bad agents. Is that we need to work as a society to become more coherent, accepting of each other, and less unequal, so we don't actually provide the context for malicious intentions to access substances that could otherwise be used to so much good,
Hmm.
like psychedelics are, and put them into this context. But yeah, there is definitely a risk. There
Hmm.
is definitely a risk, and one way to not to avoid this risk is by, as I said, individual people educating themselves now and then trying to implement a system that teaches others about psychedelics, their use, and their dangers. So yeah, information is potentially the best thing that we can do to prevent any such accidents.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, thinking about a society where that isn't going to happen feels like a lofty goal, especially given how we currently respond to other larger, maybe much more significant concerns globally, such as climate change,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
like ongoing pollution and such. But let's get into some specific stuff. In your talks, you are normally referencing LSD. And yet, we do have information on how ketamine affects the brain. We also have information on how psilocybin affects the brain. We have some cool information around psilocybin and the hippocampus, and also psilocybin and the amygdala and like fear conditioning and stuff like this. So with that, you can probably extrapolate and hypothesize about how they
Sure.
change. What about these different psychedelics? So I want to start with, in particular, psilocybin. I mean, maybe you can differentiate between psilocybin and LSD, what we know about LSD. But what I'm curious about with psilocybin is this ability for psilocybin to, in rats do like fear extinguishing, but then also in humans to have this long-term impact on amygdala function, which leads people to be more susceptible to emotionally responding to not just negative faces, but neutral and positive faces as well. So maybe like a greater emotional empathy or something, emotional openness. Can you just maybe talk a bit about LSD in the beginning and then get into this
Sure.
psilocybin stuff?
Sure. So the reason why I actually use LSD in my talks quite a lot and why I do tend to focus on LSD is because historically speaking is the one which received the most attention for therapeutic potential. And we're talking about, historically speaking, like mostly in the 60s, where psilocybin wasn't as much researched as LSD was. Psilocybin is more of something that came up out of our alleys in research, to say it so, in the past couple of years, especially because of the studies going on at Imperial. And not only, there is a lot of other labs that have been investigating the substances, but I guess the main difference between these two substances would be one, the length of action. LSD is usually around 12 hours, while psilocybin only around 5-6. So I guess one of the reasons why I'm mentioning LSD specifically for the reconsolidation application is because it provides you with a longer period of time for putting that therapy into practice. This is not to say that quantity over quality, but again, this is not something that has been checked experientially yet in any experiment, so I cannot fully comment on that. But both psilocybin and LSD do have quite similar ways of action into the brain, and they are perhaps, out of all of the psychedelics, the most similar, I would say. So if you are to correlate the effects of all of the other psychedelics, experientially speaking, LSD and psilocybin seem to be the most similar. And to a certain degree, I do believe that what we can infer based on the action of LSD is also valid to psilocybin. And it's interesting what you're saying here about psilocybin making people more prone to these emotional states later on. And here, I'm not sure whether this is related to memory exactly, but what came to my mind when you were saying this is rather that when you are experiencing very, very intense emotional states under the influence of a drug, you may experience intense states that you've never experienced before. So suddenly your bar is raised. So while it's currently somewhere in the middle, I would say it does raise the bar for your threshold for what you can experience. And then everything that happens in your life, instead of happening in this from zero to middle experience, it's on a much larger scale. And you can you relate back to that state whenever you compare a new emotion, I would say. And that makes other things seem more salient or not. And this is why people are more in touch with their emotions. Now, this is, of course, just in theory. Now, to talk a bit about differentially how different psychedelics and different drugs can be used for memory modulation, well, I think that there is a lot to uncover here, actually, a hell of a lot, if I am to be correct. Just taking LSD and psilocybin separately for a second, as I've mentioned before, I think other substances of interest would be things like DMT, for example, which I think DMT is a very interesting substance, and particularly for the study of consciousness. However, it might not necessarily be a particularly useful substance for the study of memory and for using in application for memory reconsolidation, not only because it lasts very little, but because what people tend to experience, based on what the research is saying, when they are in the DMT state is a completely separate reality. So they kind of lose touch with what is happening in this world. So then you could only hope that the substance is doing something at a biological level alone for dealing with the memories. While LSD and psilocybin are special here because they do provide this increased period of time when you can actually engage the psychological aspect together with the cellular molecular aspect in order to get your desired outcome, which is not something that's necessarily possible during DMT because people are sometimes not even able to hear or speak with others from the external world while they're in that state. And then with ketamine, as I've mentioned, that study that came out last year seems to have given very, very promising results. So I'm interested to see whether this is going to be carried on forward and whether ketamine is actually going to end up being used, be the first drug, the first psychoactive psychedelic drug that is used routinely in clinics, perhaps in a couple of years' time for dealing with intrusive memories or with addiction, PTSD, using this reconsolidation framework, because there is currently to date is the only drug that we actually have empirical evidence to suggest that might be working in humans in this context. Yeah. Well, for the others, we need to do it next. Yeah.
So now I've got some. I mean, when you brought up DMT, it brought up another question, which is the concept of like state dependent learning. Where it's like there are certain things that might be learned, but they are gone when the context in which they're learned is gone. We talked about that earlier when it was like the cue was my external environment, but then maybe the cue is a particular sort of physiological disposition, a certain sort of like affective disposition that is unique to the psychedelic, that without that, we're not as able to access certain things. And so then you have DMT is, I mean, the issue of not being able to talk on it. Well, that's one thing. But then there's also the issue of like 90% of the experience being gone within a few minutes of getting back to reality. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on this loss of the memory of the experience and why that might be the case.
Sure. So I didn't talk about this much, but I have thought about it for a very long time because it's very interesting, right? You have these substances, you give them to a person, or you don't. No one should do this. Like,
don't deal drugs, kids.
So you have these substances, a person takes them, and then suddenly they do have access to this increased repertoire of their memories, and they enter this world when they can be remodulating them. But then the experience itself is not actually recollected in much detail when you're out of it. But it is still encoded. And here I can only talk about anecdotal evidence because, again, there's no actual study today that looks at how people remember things under the influence of psychedelics to this in this particular context. But anecdotally speaking, based on talking to people who have taken these substances before and so on, what you realize is that people tend to remember their previous psychedelic experiences the best when they are also on psychedelics. Yeah. And this is the case with LSD. This is the case with DMT specifically, where people may be meeting these entities, the space elves, or regardless of how they want to call it, they have many names. And then they remember everything from their previous trip and their previous trip and so on. And in that state, they can remember this. Well, I suppose state-dependent learning is a very, very strong process, right? And it's similar with the environment that you were mentioning earlier. Like when you were in your hometown, you could remember so many things. But when you weren't there, if someone asked you, do you remember what games you used to play with your neighbors on the street? You weren't necessarily able to think about that in as much detail and depth as when you were actually in the hometown. And my thoughts on this are that I'm not sure whether we are going to be able to like ever take everything out of the experience back into the sober state. I'm not sure if this is possible. I hope it is, but it's a very, very difficult methodological challenge here, because when you are thinking about things like memory and then dependent learning and so on, and psychedelics specifically, there's only so much into the environment that you can measure, where the most powerful tool that you're relying on is the self-report of the person. And that self-report is going to be affected in the psychedelic experience. If you're going to ask someone to recall their other psychedelic experience just to test whether and how well this process is working, their speech function might be impaired by the experience itself. So therefore, this makes information extracting very difficult. And what is even more difficult here is that you would get someone to tell you during a psychedelic experience a simple sentence, which for you is what it is. It's the door was black. That's what it was for you. But for this person, the very idea of door might actually relate to so many other concepts because of the strong associations that people, the associations that people are able to form during psychedelics and how suggestible they are and so on. And the fact that it was black might actually mean a trillion of other things as well. And they're not conveying that because they're clearly unable, but there is other information. So I think that is very, very difficult to study this from a methodological perspective. But I'm confident that the solution would be somewhere in the realm of technology, to be fair. Somewhere in the realm of looking at speech, for example, using advanced processes such as natural language processing, which has been previously used in studies on psychedelics. Enzo Tagliazucchi's lab in Argentina did something on this, which was very, very interesting. They screened the Arrowhead reports and used this AI algorithm of natural language processing to look at what people were talking about. So this might be one way of extracting information and then trying to build this huge model where you also input the brain activity data as well as cognitive tasks data and all of the other factors in the environment. But yeah, I do think that it's a very interesting question. Why can't we actually take everything we want out of the experience out into the world again? And why is it only available in that state? Yeah.
I guess, like, having asked the question, it's fair to suggest that I can't remember everything I did yesterday as well. But there's something I think about the added experience of profundity of how profound it is that makes it feel like you could never forget it because it's just so meaningful. And yet within a couple, I mean, with DMT, it could be within, 20 minutes, a half hour, you forget what it was, even moments, right? But with even like our most powerful psychedelic revelations, people might be 2, 3, 4 weeks and having totally forgot everything about it if intentional efforts aren't made to carry it into long-term memory or something.
Yeah, so here is where psychedelics have been previously associated with dreams quite a lot. Because similarly with dreams, while you're in the dream, it might seem very, very vivid and actually relating to reality in many, many different ways. And you might not even know that you're dreaming unless you're trained in lucid dreaming or similar practices many times. But then it's nearly impossible to recall them after a while, and especially after time, you only get the gist of it out. And I think, I think we could go back to one of the earliest metaphors on psychedelics, that they're like a microscopy into the human experience, really. So the human experience would be something of this size, but then you magnify that through a glass and then you can see all of these different details. But then once you take the glass away, you only have the same dot that you were looking at from afar. If
and whatever you remember.
Exactly. And that dot then undergoes the same processes of consolidation and reconsolidation of all of your other normal memories. But in the absence of this magnifying glass, you can't actually see the details. And I think there's something to be taken away from here, that it is a very difficult question to ask. And the way to keep remembering what's happening would essentially mean that you have to always have a magnifying glass over it, or extract enough information through the magnifying glass that you can take out and then recall later. And one way to do this, and which people are doing in research, for example. So in research settings, people are obviously asked to talk about their trips quite extensively straight after the trip has finished. And while they may not remember entirely at that point, they surely do remember more than they would remember if they haven't written everything down at that time and later. And I think what's special about psychedelics is that this magnifying glass is more magnifying than anything else that we do have out there, which is further exacerbating the problem. But at the end of the day, there are other things that we can look at that have similar properties, such as intense emotional experiences. For example, if you are witnessing a bank robbing or something,
or birth,
or birth, or anything
positive,
like this. Exactly. And psychedelics have actually been compared to the birth of a child in terms of the importance that they have in people's lives. I think similarly, you can take with such experience that in the moment you're so emotionally engaged and every single detail is so salient to you. While once you're out of it, you only get with a sentence: this person has been given birth in front of me. It was intense, full stop. While in the moment, it's more of like this person who's giving birth has this foot in this exact angle, and this is what's happening. And perhaps this is just something that comes to my mind right now. Perhaps this is actually something that's like an evolutionary advantage for humans. When you are in particularly emotionally engaging situations, do pay more attention to the details around, because if you pay more attention to the details around, when similar situations are going to occur in the future, you're going to be more aware of the environment, and this is going to be useful for you to either escape the situation or do whatever you are able to do or want to do then. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because yes, likely for many of us, we'll just remember sort of how it felt and then the sentence of the baby was birth. But then it is possible for us to intentionally effort towards remembering things in a more complex or even poetic way. I mean, using poetry is usually, I feel like poetic, associative, metaphorical language is so much more effective to explain what's happening with psychedelics than trying to literally describe something that is literally beyond the language I've learned to understand and navigate and orient reality. But that there are efforts that can be made to increase the ability to recall the full, or at least a greater spectrum of what was happening there. Just like, I am much better at dream recall than my partner is. And that's because she never made it, and still doesn't choose to make any effort to try to remember, where I have a whole history of much of my life since I was a teenager being completely enamored by the idea of dreaming and intentional dreaming and lucid dreaming and remembering my dreams, that I have it as a skill set that I've developed over the years. So that there's a possibility there of developing. This is, I guess, the issue of integration comes in, because we do an integrative practice in order to, effectively make sure we remember what is most impactful or most meaningful in our day-to-day lives, and then finding ways to do that. But then also as a skill set, our ability to our ability to intentionally remember things that we developed, or intentionally remember things that otherwise we would have forgotten if we didn't develop the skill to remember those things. Just like you're developing the skill as an academic to remember certain things in certain ways, somebody who is a psychonaut develops the ability to remember and describe things about their psychedelic experiences in a way that somebody who hasn't developed that skill wouldn't be able to. So I think there's a lot of space and possibility there to train the mind to be able to be greater at bringing more back than it sort of inherently might.
Absolutely. So I do definitely agree with what you're saying, and I think that there are ways. Chunking, for example, is one mnemotic way of remembering things. So that is like categorizing things into different chunks, breaking the situation apart. So in the terms of the psychedelic trip, we could make a parallel. Let's just say that the person, okay, first hour, it's been about this, make a note here, and then so on and so on. And then at the end, when they go over it, then they can think about each of the subtitles in sight and then expand on each of them, just like in a fractal. So no, there's definitely a lot of things that can be done for individuals to do, remember, if that's what they wish to pursue, of course. But I guess that the question it becomes a bit more difficult when we're talking about research settings, because when we're talking about research settings, there's only so much that you can ask of people to be trained into this type of remembering the experiences. And this is also something that's entirely subjective at the end of the day. In the absence of any standardized measuring tools that we can use to say to what degree is this person able to recall their dreams in general more than this other person. So these are not currently things that would be straightforward to implement into the scientific pursuit. However, I do agree that in terms of personal development and people trying to remember their dreams, for example, there are various ways that they can train themselves to do this, and your example is very, very much speaking for that anecdotally.
Yeah,
so
I'm glad you added that at the end, because as you were describing its sort of lack of like pragmatism for research, I was like, oh well, I mean that makes sense because you're a research scientist, you're thinking about research. I'm an author or podcaster. I'm thinking about like, how do I integrate this into my lived life as a full human being? And I'm not too worried about research methodologies in the process. I got two more questions here.
Sure.
Before we close. And the first one is it's kind of jumping back, and you sort of talked about it already, about different psychedelics. And pharmacologically, LSD and psilocybin, very similar. But LSD and psilocybin, very different than ketamine, right? And LSD and psilocybin, very different from ketamine, but also, say, from nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide may be unfair to call it a psychedelic, highly psychoactive, of course, in the sub-anesthetic doses. Similarly for ketamine, which may be unfair to call it a psychedelic, but certainly closer to psychedelic than booze or something. But if I know correctly, ketamine and nitrous both have direct impact on glutamate transmission. And with ketamine in particular, the NMDA receptor, which is essential in learning.
Yes.
So I could see how with LSD and psilocybin, the capacity to modulate the brain in a way that creates a psychological, emotional experience where people are able to bring more novel iterations of old memories to the surface, and being in such as what is claimed with psilocybin, a highly susceptible place, highly, what's the word I'm looking for? Suggestible place, can lead to intentionally, infusing new meaning into old memories. But with ketamine, and I mean, I'm throwing in nitrous here because I'm recently quite interested in it. No comment. But the action pharmacologically is so different. Can you maybe talk about what the difference in actions there around specifically impacting glutamate transmission for memory modulation might be there in comparison to serotonergic modulation? Yeah.
Sure. So the first point that I would like to make here is that, as you've mentioned as well, with talking about this infusing of meaning, which I like very much, the expression of this infusing meaning into old memories using the classical psychedelics such as LSD or psilocybin, there is a huge psychological component here. And as I've mentioned earlier, I just want to reiterate this, that when we're talking about memories and the activity of drugs as memory modulators, what we are actually talking about is an interplay between pharmacology and psychology. And this interplay is going to have different ratios depending on what substance we're talking about. So while with the classical psychedelics, this interplay might have a higher psychological component. With things like ketamine, I don't know that much about nitros more than anecdotal information. I have not really read much nitros literature in my life, but
might be an unfair inclusion. But when I was thinking about glutamate things, it was there, and some nitrous experiments have been happening in my life. So, yeah,
sure. It is an anesthetic in principle, right? And I'm not 100% sure. Perhaps we can check this information later, but I suppose it's also an NMDA antagonist, just like ketamine is.
Well, I'm not sure.
As I don't know anything about nitros. Actually, I shouldn't be talking about really.
We'll just put that on the back burner.
But yeah. Ketamine, right? So ketamine is interesting because it acts directly on the NMDA receptors. So what this would mean in theory is that ketamine is going to prevent you from forming new memories of that particular experience and what's happening right that moment. So it's going to be very difficult for you to take things from that experience and then reprocess them later. But it's very, very useful in the process of reconsolidation because it actually acts exactly the pharmacological action of ketamine, which is, I guess, the main reason why people start using this in research or in the derivatives, just as I was using back in the day, is because it has this antagonistic reaction towards the NMDA receptor, so it can prevent the formation of new memories. But as we've mentioned earlier, the formation of new memories is very, very similar to the reinterpretation of old memories, which undergo a very similar process of the reconsolidation. So what ketamine, you could say, is doing is exactly blocking the reconsolidation of old memories. So you are essentially not going to be able to stabilize them, to keep them in a stable format. So when ketamine is applied during the recollection of the memories, that is going to be impaired. And I'm just going to take the example of the study that I mentioned earlier once again. I think that what we see there is that for sure it was very difficult for these people to reconsolidate the memory of alcohol being a rewarding stimuli. And this might be the explanation of why their alcoholism decreased in the subsequent weeks after the treatment. And this was triggered by these negative cues that the people were seeing. Now, what is an interesting question to ask in a very fine-grained way of looking at the brain is, to what extent is this effect been caused by ketamine disrupting the reconsolidation of the reward associated with alcohol, and to what extent is ketamine helping allowing you to encode a new memory of that alcohol being presented as a poisonous substance. So there's these two things here which have not been very, very clearly defined so far, but this would be one of the main interesting questions if we are to look into a more finer grain and understand how various substances impact the reconsolidation of memories and generally memory. But yeah, all in all, the most important thing to keep in mind is that the ratio between psychology and pharmacology is going to be different for each of the substances. And yeah, that's what I would have to say on it.
Great. So in closing out, before we get opportunity, like where we'll go to figure out how to follow your research over time and how to follow up more so on what you've said here today, what Talk to me about the Great British Intelligence Test and psychedelics. You, when we were in communication about
Okay.
this, you were very excited about a project that you want to move forward with, and it was connected with this Great British Intelligence
Yeah.
Test.
So
Can you tell us about it and where it stands insofar as its development
yeah,
and our ability to
sure.
participate?
Sure. So the Great British Intelligence Test is a project of my lab, of my supervisor, actually, Dr. Adam Hampshire. He's launched this platform called the Cognitron, where people can go and play various of the usual neurocognitive tasks that are given to people in neuropsychological assessments, for example, in clinics or when they go to the psychologist. We Over the past couple of years, we turned these tasks that usually take 30 minutes per task and are horrible for people as an experience to be completing when they are volunteering for research. We turned them into games, into 2 to 3 minutes games
Hmm.
that people can play online. And last year we filmed this TV series with the BBC where we've turned these games into 3D models. So there were people across the UK, families actually competing to try to find the most intelligent people in the country. And that was very interesting. And our collaboration with the BBC continued to present. And now we launched the second wave of the study. And if people do want to take the test, it's GBIT, so Great British Intelligence Test.cognitron.co.uk, and they can go there and play all of the tests. So far, we have a couple of hundreds of thousands of people who have
Wow.
completed this, which is
Hmm.
absolutely amazing.
We lost you, so I lost the last 30 seconds of what you're saying. So
No.
you had just finished saying we have hundreds of thousands of people who have taken it, which is
Yes.
very exciting. Go.
Yes, exactly. So we have hundreds of thousands of people who have been taking it, which is a very exciting data set. It's actually unique in the world to have this much cognitive data on people's performance in health. So I've been very inspired by this pursuit and thinking that this could be also used to try to understand how psychedelics do change cognition of people. And I'm currently into the process of trying to get ethical approval for this project. So you're going to be able to hear more about whether I'm launching it once my project passes ethical approval and everything, and see how that goes. It shouldn't be too long, and I'm hoping to be able to launch this summer. Um, and the main reason why I would like to launch this project is because this is part of one of my wider pursuits, generally, which is trying to map how cognition changes in different states, be that a neurologically induced state by one of the neurological conditions that people might have, or be that a drug-induced stage, and so on. So essentially what I'm going to try to do is to give people who are on psychedelics and surfing the web the opportunity to volunteer some of their times to science, if so they may wish. By no means this is not an encouragement for people to take psychedelics. This is just, if you are taking psychedelics in the comfort of your house or wherever you are and you have connection to internet, and then you want to go online and play some games and see how you perform compared to all of these other people in the normal sober states, I think that would be a very useful thing for science in general to have. The way that I'm going to be running this is through my impromptu lab. I do have a group of scientists that I have brought together for the purpose of conducting field research on psychedelics last year, and we continue to be working together on designing this project, which is called the Science Camp. Science as in PS, science, PSY,
Nice.
like
Yeah, yeah.
psychedelic, but
Yeah.
science. And if people want to find out more about that, we're going to be launching a website very soon. It's simply science.camp. It's like, welcome to the science camp. And that's where they can find more information about what's yet to come, and also contact information of myself and my colleagues, and send emails. And yeah, this has been a great, it is a very dear project to me. And I hope that we can bring about some good contributions to science by understanding how psychedelics affect people, especially in naturalistic settings, because the whole premise is that people would be undertaking the test when they're in their homes or where at a festival, wherever they're willing to be when they want to engage in this. It's completely up to them. We're going to be asking, where are you in the moment? Because I do strongly believe that what is currently not that much pursued in psychedelics research is trying to understand how psychedelics affect cognition of the day-to-day person who's taking them recreationally. Mm-hmm. There has been a lot of focus on the therapeutic potential, which is absolutely amazing. But this means that we have a huge body of knowledge about therapeutics, while we don't have a huge body of knowledge of what happens to the end user, the one that wants them to be legalized so they can pursue their recreational pursuits in peace. What happens to that person? Because that's the safety of those people is very important. And at home or wherever people do choose to take psychedelics generally, they do not have they do not always have the setting that we can, for example, provide in a university hospital setting for people, together with having a team of specialists at their disposal to ensure that they're safe. So I'm wondering whether the results that we see in people's performance on cognitive tasks in the laboratory are different to those who just do it at home at their leisure.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I mean, I'd say like the vast majority of people doing psychedelics aren't people doing it medically, clearly, or in science. So these are the stats that I think will be most meaningful to get an understanding of how psychedelics in general are impacting people, and thus a better understanding of how psychedelics are/could be impacting society as a whole.
Yeah. So I'm really hoping that I'm going to get going with the study this summer and bring some results that we can discuss widely in the scientific community afterwards.
Great. Well, I'll be sure that when the study is live, that it gets shared through my networks, through my subreddit and through my Facebook and stuff. Of course. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
But in the meantime, how do people who are listening follow your work more fully? Where would you point them to if they wanted to get a better understanding of your research?
Right. So with my research, I'm that type of person who does a lot of internal speaking, but whenever I do have something that's like, whenever I have a publication or whenever I do give a talk or something, that is shared on my Twitter, and that is EMMSSKYYY.
Got it. I'll make sure that your Twitter handle is included in the links to the show notes of this episode. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, James, for inviting me. It's been very nice to reconnect after a couple of years.
And cut. Thank you very much for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Please give Maria a follow on Twitter, and if you get a chance, go check out Science Camp, PSYENCE.camp. Although it's not up yet, it will be soon, and possibly you're listening to this months after it comes out and it's already up and ready. So check it out. Also, please follow me on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, all at James W. Jesso, and share this episode with a friend. Big thanks for that. That goes a long way, since the algorithms aren't always super supportive of my content. So your shares go a long way. If you'd like to give financially to the show, I'd really appreciate that. And you can do so by going to jameswjesso.com/support by becoming a patron of the show on Patreon, leaving a one-time PayPal donation, or grabbing something from the shop at jameswjesso.com. Thank you very much for that. I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind, and until then, take care.